I'm so happy to be here. It's been a while since I've seen you. Now, the guys in back are supposed to get me my first slide, so I'm hoping they'll follow through on that. A couple years ago, when we did the first edition of Fashion Designers A to Z, I spoke here and talked a little bit about the history of collections and exhibitions. So today what I want to do is go, in a sense, into our archive and show you a few of our treasures. We have now more than 50,000 garments and accessories from the 18th century to the present. Here we go, good. And we put this book together with choosing about 500 of our most important pieces, focusing on the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries, although we also had sections in the beginning where we gave you some information and images of 18th century and 19th century dresses as well. But the publisher Taschen wanted to organize it by designer. This A to Z methodology is really common. Now they've brought out a less expensive version of the book, which is great because now it can be bought by students. And also it's much lighter, because the old one, I practically needed my assistant to help me carry it. If you have one, it's in this gigantic plexiglass box, and it's like being a weightlifter to go into it. So one of the earliest pieces in our collection is this beautiful robe à la Française. And most fashion collections have mostly 19th century things. Our collection is unusual in as much as it has mostly 20th and 21st century. But we do have a few 18th century and quite a number of 19th century pieces. The 18th century ones we continue to try and buy, but as you can imagine, they're rarer and rarer. So because we set up a fashion history gallery, where you can see kind of the history of different themes in fashion, like seduction, or right now we have uniforms, or in December we'll open the history of black fashion designers. I wanted to keep getting historical pieces. It's harder and harder with these 18th century ones. Although a few years ago we were able to get one 18th century gown, really beautiful, had in the back, hidden where you couldn't see it, a tiny mouse hole. It had been stored in a furniture store and mice had settled into it. So here we have this gorgeous dress. This one I'll hope to be using in a couple of years when I do a big show in 2019 called Paris Capital of Fashion. So hold on for that one. This gives you a sense of how we have done exhibitions at the museum ever since the building was built in the early 1970s. This was one of our historic exhibitions on Paul Poiret, done in about 1974. And at that point, Madame Denise Poiret was still alive. And so some things were borrowed from her, from other collections. But amazingly enough, even before the museum was officially founded in 1969, before the building was built in 71, there was a pioneering curator who was starting to put together the collection. And as I was doing research for this book, the history of our collection, I went through all of his records, and I found letters that he'd written, like a letter to this woman whose mom had been a big Poiret wearer. And he writes, "Oh, do you think you have any of your mom's clothes?" And she says, "Oh, no, those are all long gone." And he said, "Well, I'm coming to France this summer. How about I just visit the chateau and look in the attic?" So naturally, there were Poirets in there. So he was already collecting things before everything. And I think when you think of a fashion museum, you think primarily of collections and exhibitions. The two really go together. You can have a Kunsthalle, an art exhibition hall, which just does exhibitions and borrows everything. But it's so much easier and more meaningful, I think, if you can build a collection as well. And that's one of the key things I'll talk to you today about, is like, how do you build a collection? What are you looking for? Okay, now we're in the letter A, and you can be reassured I'm not going to walk all the way through the alphabet. I've just chosen a few key favorite pieces of mine, from A through, I think, the letter P, or something like that. So I didn't run out of time completely. Azzedine Alaïa, okay, an incredibly brilliant designer. As you know, born in Tunisia, moved to Paris, where he still lives, the man who really figured out how to do body-worshiping clothes for the late 20th century. And he has done research in our collection, and in exchange, he's given us things as presents. So, for example, once he came in, he was really attracted to 19th century Amazon, a riding habit that a woman wore. And I think that helped inspire one of his suits, which is, of course, a very form-fitting, beautiful suit. We're working on a show now, which will open in December, on black fashion designers. And there's a little section in it on famous black fashion models and the designers they were associated with. So Veronica Webb, who for years has been giving us beautiful Azzedine Alaïa pieces, because she was a pioneering model for him, she will talk and put one of her Alaïa pieces in that exhibition. Now this one is, it's hard to choose a favorite, but this is one of my favorites, and it gives you a sense of what he does, because of course it's completely body covering, but body worshiping. And what's really cool about it is, around it is a curving zipper, so that when you unzip it, basically the body is gradually exposed and that just falls off. So it's, the whole concept of this dress is so intensely erotic. So we're avidly collecting Alaïas. So if you know someone who perhaps, and this is the commonest thing, no longer fits in the clothes, that is the #1 reason why people volunteer to give you things, then tell them we're very interested in Alaïas. We think he's a very important designer. He's also has an amazing private collection of historic clothing, but he's very reluctant to show it, doesn't want to lend it to other museums. He's hoping to set up his own museum, which would include this amazing collection with Paul Poiret's and Madeleine Vianney's and Charles James, etc. Balenciaga. Okay, we have hundreds of Balenciagas. When they did the big show at the Musée de la Mode in Paris, big show on Balenciaga, we loaned a number of pieces. It's hard to choose. There are a number of great later Balenciagas from the 60s that we have, which are really radical, and you can see how he wasn't just a creator of elegant dresses in the 30s and 40s, but someone who was definitely pushing forward towards the modernism that we associate with Cardin, Courrèges, and the shapes. But this is such a favorite of mine. It was given by Tina Chow, so it has a wonderful provenance, the beautiful model and collector. It's from about 1938. So it's an early Balenciaga. He had been working already for a while in Spain and then opened his couture house in Paris in the 1930s, in part because the civil war in Spain was making life difficult to live there. And it's cut velvet. It's just unbelievably beautiful. It harkens back to Spanish black. I mean, that black has been such an important color in Spanish fashion history. And, sort of the black of a night without stars, a kind of a black that's really powerful, and with the velvet that just sort of absorbs light. So it's an incredibly beautiful dress. Now rather fragile. We'd only use it for things that are very important, and we'd probably be reluctant to loan this overseas anywhere anymore. And this is always a hard call, because people always ask us about borrowing things, and if you look at our website, which please do, we have a section on FIT on the road, and we're always lending to exhibitions around the world, but it's exhausting and it tires the clothes out. The clothes are like, they're not like oil paintings. They're more like works on paper, and there's a limit to how much light that can be on them, how much stress can be on having them hanging on a mannequin. So you have to be very, very careful. It's a very bad practice to be shopping exhibitions around and around and around the world. It just kills the clothes. Well, here's another B. I couldn't resist having a couple. A Manolo Blahnik. We actually were just approached by Taschen a couple weeks ago. They now want to do a book with us on our 500 best shoes, which is a great opportunity to shop. Because although we have about 5,000 pairs of shoes, and our first step is to go through and see what are maybe the 400 best ones we have, but we want to go shopping and get more shoes. So once again, if you know someone, for example, who has those fabulous Prada shoes, which were like 1950s cars with flames coming out, we want those. So if you know someone who has divine shoes that they've stopped wearing, we're really looking at this moment for shoes. We're going to be working on the shoe book for the next 2 years. It took us 3 years to do this book, involving everyone in the museum with the photography, writing the essays, etc. And so the shoe book is next. Probably in 2020, we'll do a big shoe exhibition, which I'm thinking we're going to fill the entire museum. Then in the Fashion History Gallery on top, we'll have the history of shoes. And then downstairs, where a few years ago we had Shoe Obsession, we'll do 20th and 21st century shoes. That Shoe Obsession show was probably the most popular one we ever had. There's something about shoes, you know, sort of like when Freud asked, what do women want? I think you might say that one possible answer would be shoes. This is cute too, because when I had Manolo Blahnik in my office, and I opened the big A to Z book, and accidentally, and I couldn't have planned this, it opened to this page. And he's like, how could you get it to open to that? And then he said how when I first printed this image, he said, oh, that shoe was so knocked off, everybody stole it after it was in the book because they saw it, they might not have seen it before in the stores. It's so beautiful because of the red lining, the peep toe, the stiletto heel, and the kind of animalier exoticism of that zebra stripe. Pierre Cardin. This is made of a new material, and so it's heat molded with this three-dimensional geometric designs in it. It's a very, very important piece because of that. We have a lot of really nice Cardins. Cardin's an interesting designer. We featured him quite heavily about years ago when I did a show, Form Follows Fashion, which was about shapes in clothing. But he's going to be featured heavily in a big show we're doing this spring, which will open in February, which is called Paris Refashioned, 1957 to 1968. And my colleague Colleen Hill, who you may have seen her fairy tale fashion show a year ago, which was also hugely popular. This was her topic for her master's thesis, and she really knows about this period in French history, which is, most shows are about 47 to 57, kind of the golden age of the French couture. But she wanted to explore 57 to 67. And I said to her, oh, please, Colleen, bring in 68 too, because that's the May Revolution in Paris. So she did that as well. And it's going to be a really super show. And one of the cool things is every single thing in that show is from our collection. So because I've been hemorrhaging money bringing over to New Yorkers the show I have up now, Proust's Muse, the Countess Grefful, which I brought from the collection at the Galliera, we had to do something which was thrilling, but also not as expensive. So that's one of the reasons we put in something which is based entirely on our own collection. Since having brought over 40 objects, and all the conservators, and all the air for shipping and everything else, and paying for conservation. And I'm sort of like, I really need to take a little bit of pause in spending money, because that show was a killer. But I just fell in love with it. From the minute Olivier told me he was doing this show on the Countess Grefful, and that he had her wardrobe at the Palais Galliera, I knew I wanted to bring it to New York. Seems to me the colors should be brighter for this. This is one of our Chanels. And of course, there's some 60 Chanels that are going to be in Colleen's show, Paris Refashioned. But what I'm really gearing up for is Paris Capital of Fashion in 2019, because then we'll be having Chanel in different periods of her life, like the 20s and 30s, and then the period after the war when she reopens. And of course, we're going to look at, you know, the mythology of the little black dress, but as you can see here, although she professed to be nauseated by Poiret's brilliant colors, and that she said that's why she brought in black and navy and beige, nevertheless, she certainly did use color in her work. I'm doing a show in 2018 called Thinking About Pink in Fashion, Art, and Culture. So I was looking through catalogs from different museums and saw a beautiful little 1920s pink dress by Chanel with flowers all over it. You don't think of 20s Chanel as being pink floral, but it wasn't all little black dresses. Lagerfeld for Chanel. Now, Chanel, when she died in 71, the house really was kind of haute bourgeois, pretty boring. It's so interesting because Chanel, who'd had the shortest skirts in Paris in the 1920s, got very conservative in her old age and hated mini skirts and said that knees were ugly. And, so the clothes had gotten a bit drab by the time she finally died. And then they were in a limbo for a while. The house still was there, but no one really was buying it except, Madame Pompadour, not exactly a fashion trendsetter. And then when Lagerfeld came in, 83, 84, he completely revolutionized the house of Chanel, broke down and re-put together all of the famous tropes of the house. So here, from the first couture collection, he's got the idea of the costume jewelry and the little black dress, but it's all trompe-l'oeil jewelry sewn onto it. This is a real masterpiece. And this one is something that was given to the museum by the House of Chanel. So that, of course, is another way we get objects. They might be donated to us by collectors, or we might get them from the fashion houses, or we might buy them at auction or from dealers. Occasionally, once in a blue moon, even something from eBay. Comme des garçons. Well, my husband says that my credit card should not say American Express, it should just say Comme des garçons, because I've spent so much on them over the years. But Ray Kawakubo, who you know is going to have a solo show at the Costume Institute next spring, is really one of the most revolutionary designers in the world, one that other designers are inspired by. And that's one of the things we're looking for when we collect. We're not looking necessarily for things that are the most popular. We're not looking for things that are made in New York or that are worn by every man. Museum of the City of New York wants things that are made or worn in New York. The Smithsonian wants sort of the clothing of every man. The First Lady's stuff is in a separate political category at the Smithsonian. It doesn't belong to the costume department. What we want as a fashion museum is fashion that moves fashion forward, fashion that's directional. So Comme des Garçons always been a very important part of what we buy. And then, of course, a few years ago, when I did my big show, Japan Fashion Now, then we were really buying Japanese fashion right and left. And some of the things I borrowed, now I could kick myself for not having insisted that we buy them then, because there's so many important Japanese designers, but Ray is really top of the line. If you look at this outfit, for example, this from what was known popularly as her biker ballerina collection. And all of these sort of biker-like jackets, thick leather, big Frankenstein stitches, and then the light girly pink skirts underneath. And she doesn't talk much about what her collections mean, but she said in this one that it was about how women were strong. That you think that a ballerina might be, a weak little frail thing, but in fact you need so much discipline and strength. A ballerina is not just an artist, he or she is also an athlete. And so she was trying to get across this message. And of course we're going to be featuring her fairly heavily in the pink exhibition, because she was one of the people who pioneered changing pink and its connotations from like Tricia Nixon, Mamie Eisenhower pink to a kind of powerful punk pink, a feminist pink. And that's something that's a very important feature, plus mixing in that whole Japanese kawaii cute pink, which is so much a part of Japanese contemporary street style.
When is the pink show?
2018, September. I'm writing the book right now. Okay, courage. You can see why I couldn't go through the whole alphabet. It would take us forever. This is wonderful because it's the whole look. And it's the whole kind of space-age moon girl look. You see pieces come up for sale, but it's rare to get all the accessories, the glasses, etc. Very, very important, but a fleeting style. And it's interesting in terms of fashion history because whereas the English and the Americans had a real youth style and lined up with rock and roll, the French didn't really have a youth culture in the same way. I mean, Françoise Hardy is charming, but she's not exactly the Rolling Stones. So what the French designers did was instead of drawing on it from a youth culture, they drew on the idea of modernity, which often translated as a kind of space-age futurism. So they'd go for this idea of moon girl. And Courrèges, of course, famously said, "I'm the man who invented the miniskirt, not Mary Quant. Mary Quant just popularized it." And Mary Quant just said, "Well, that's not how I remember it. But anyway, it wasn't him or me. It was the girls in the street who invented the miniskirt." Dior. We've been working with the House of Dior because they're going to be doing a big show, I don't think this is a secret, at the Musée de la Mode in Paris in a year. And so they were coming over, photographing a lot of our work. And this is one of my favorite pieces. It's very elegant from about 1953 and shows how Dior came in with this image of sort of ultra femininity. And then each season would slightly modify the silhouette so that you had all the names like the H line, the Y line, the A line, bringing in very much a sense of movement and change in fashion and building this excitement around fashion so that between 47 and 57, Dior not only supercharged the French couture back into an international position, but himself was responsible for a very large percentage of French fashion exports to the world. This was done for John Galliano when he was at Dior Couture. And this is something that I got from a dealer. And he told me that afterwards Harold Coda at the Met said, "Why didn't you sell that to me?" And he's like, "Well, I knew Valerie would like it because she really loves corsets." And he was right, because this was something that I just had to have for the exhibit, for the collection. It seemed so incredibly important and so witty and clever and surreal. Fortuny. We have a beautiful Fortuny now in Proust's Muse, a lovely jacket that was worn by the Countess Grefful. And it plays an important role in Proust's novel, where the narrator talks to the Duchesse de Guermantes, who's based in large part on the Countess Grefful, and says, "What was that beautiful, mysterious garment you were wearing that had sort of gold streaks like a butterfly's wings on it?" And if she says, "Oh, that's Fortuny, he's an artist from Venice." And there's a whole, it becomes a real theme in the novel, where the narrator basically bribes his girlfriend with Fortuny dresses to stay with him. Jean-Paul Gaultier. This is one of our prize dresses, a famous cone bra dress. Very fragile now, but is a kind of a superstar piece. And as we all know, Gaultier was so inspired by childhood memories of, you know, his mother, his grandmother having her corset laced up and making sort of little cone bra-like brasiers for his teddy bear when he was a tiny child. So that this obsession fed through his whole career, and he created these very sort of gender-bending, extraordinary garments like this. So Gaultier is an interesting one. We look from Gaultier, but we have to look for things which are from particularly interesting collections. That's the other thing. We look for who are important designers who move things ahead, what are their important collections, and are there particular important pieces from those collections that you want to have on your wish list. Rudy Gernreich. These are surprisingly common, these topless bathing suits in museum collections. And I think it's because nobody ever wore them. I mean, hardly anybody wore them. People bought them, and there was dead stock with them. So a lot of museums have a Gernreich topless bathing suit. It's a fascinating thing. It's just like they all have some Courrèges things as well, because people only wore them for a short period of time. Whereas things that people wore a lot for a long time, like Mary Quant pieces, are much harder to find. Givenchy Riccardo Tisci. So very cool. Of course, we had lovely Givenchys by Hubert de Givenchy. Some that he gave to us, just as he gave our museum, some Balenciagas. But we want to keep it up to date. I always say, I probably repeat this too often, that a museum is like a shark. It has to keep moving or it dies. You have to keep collecting, and especially with fashion, which is all about change and the now, you have to keep bringing things forward. So this is something that we spoke to the House of Givenchy, and we asked for a piece. We couldn't get a couture piece, but this is a really exceptional, ready-to-wear piece. We've borrowed wonderful couture pieces from them. And about a month and a half ago, I was in Paris giving a talk about the museum collection. And I met the archivist for the House of Givenchy. So that was cool. They were giving a talk about their archive. So now we're going to be friends and meet up and talk about what gifts we need to get and what loans will be important. More and more, as you all know, being fashion experts, big fashion houses are creating their own collections of their own work. They're buying it back at auction. And usually they'll lend things. But you certainly have seen a drying up of houses that will automatically offer to give things to museums. They'd rather loan it and then bring it back. Madame Gray. I probably should have brought you a goddess dress because they're her most famous. But this day dress of hers is just so beautiful. The way the fabric is gathered on the hip and then sort of flourishes down like that. You really get a sense of how she too, in her own way, was a body-worshipping designer. And she was somebody who wanted to be an artist. One of many middle and upper middle class women who went into fashion in the 20s and 30s. Prior to that, it had been mostly a working class occupation. And she wanted to be an artist, and her parents said, no way. Artists live a disreputable life. So she said, well, then I want to study fashion. But she always treated fashion like an art form. And instead of working her way up as an apprentice, she took lessons. And then she was so nervous when she had to produce her dresses to show them to be accepted into the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture parisienne. And then she said, in the beginning, she said, I had really no idea. I'd make a beautiful dress, but sometimes the lady couldn't even move in it. It took her a while before she was able to figure out some of the more practical aspects. Tom Ford for Gucci. An amazing piece. This was a gift from the House of Gucci. We've got some new Gucci. Now we need to get from Gucci's latest designer who's transformed everything. So soon I'm going to be working on leaning on the House of Gucci to get some really great full looks. But this was wonderful to get as marking a moment in the passage of a particular house. Lately, these days, with the changes in creative directors at different houses, it's very hard to keep up. Actually, just doing this new edition of Fashion Designers A to Z, we had to make all kinds of corrections about who was the current designer because it had all changed so much in a couple of years. Halston. We have the world's best collection of Halston. Not so much because of the House of Halston giving things to us, but because so many ladies donated their Halston dresses. But now, every time they revive the House of Halston, the new designer and everyone all come in again to look at all of our Halstons. And some of you may have seen the show that my colleague Patricia Mears did just about a year ago, comparing Halston and Saint Laurent in the 1970s, which was a very daring and fascinating idea of something to do. And I myself was I wonder how it will turn out, because Saint Laurent was such an acknowledged genius, and the 70s were such a great decade for him. I kind of thought Halston wouldn't look so good in comparison. And instead, Halston looked really beautiful and modern. But it was interesting, again, it was all our own material, so we had that much great material in Halston and Saint Laurent to do the show ourselves. And it's a good thing because the Pierre Berger, Yves Saint Laurent Foundation probably wouldn't have loaned to us because Mr. Berger wasn't very keen on the idea of comparing the genius Saint Laurent with who's this American Halston. And at one point I was invited to a party there, and my friend came and she said, She said, first thing before the party, she said, "Don't worry, Mr. Berger won't yell at you. He's not angry anymore. I told him the show was great." So, I mean, he used to be such a scary guy. Now he's so old. He's like, "Well, please don't yell at me because you might, I don't know, fall down or something." Oh, this was for Hermes. So this again was, Hermes is a house where a lot of different designers have gone through. And this is when Jean-Paul Gaultier was at Hermes. And then more recently, Christophe Lemaire was there, who now has his own company, which is kind of an obsession of mine. It's the first place I go every time I'm in Paris, is to the little Christophe Lemaire store in the Marais, where they now recognize me. I bought a pair of pants there this last time I was in Paris, and the woman said, "Oh yes, you bought that same pair in cotton last summer." And I'm like, whoa, I must be shopping here a lot. But Hermes is an interesting house. I can't remember her name, the woman who's there now, but the house has its own very particular aesthetic. We've had Martin Margiela work there, all kinds of radical designers, and when they work for Hermes, they somehow manage to combine that with the DNA of the house. Carolina Herrera, we recognize that. Carolina made a wonderful donation to us of many, many of her dresses, things that she'd designed, things that she'd worn. So that was, she'd built up an archive. At a certain point, though, she's like, do I really want to be, it's a lot of work to keep up an archive. It's a lot of money. You need registrars and conservators and so on. So she decided to place a lot of things with us. And then when she was honored at SCAD, we had to scramble quickly and go down south to Savannah to bring some of the clothes down to be in her surprise exhibition down there. Irene, going through the alphabet, Irene, the Hollywood designer. We don't specifically do film costume. We have a lot of Adrian's, but they're mostly dresses and suits that he made for private clients, fashion as opposed to film costume. And same with Adrian. But we do have a few pieces that were actual film costumes that were given to us by different Hollywood companies, things that Garbo wore, etc., which it's a very interesting subject. We're not actively collecting them. On the other hand, people are so excited by that kind of thing that if someone made a donation, we are obviously interested. And the graduate students in March at FIT are doing a show about Adrian, Hollywood and beyond, which will look not only at his film costume, but also at his fashions and at his textile collaborations. Because we have one dress, for example, where the textile was created by Salvador Dali. So that's kind of an interesting look, a different look. Charles James, the most magnificent, beautiful dress. We have a lot of Charles James. The Brooklyn Museum had the most, and now those are at the Met, which really has the most, but we probably have the second largest private collection of Charles James, and they're always spectacular. They are such extraordinary works of art, and really, you can see, I think, how he started out as a milliner, not as a dressmaker, because these are engineered and constructed in a way that you might engineer and construct a hat. It's not the same kind of idea of draping that you would do with a regular dress. They're so constructed, in fact, that for a museum, they can't be hung on a hanger, and they can't lie down on flat storage. So what do? We have specially built bodies for them that they fit exactly, and then they're hung from the weight of that body so that there's no weight on the clothes, because you can't lie this down. Normally, if a fragile dress, you'd lie it down, but you can't do it. It would be the equivalent of a human being in bed getting bed sores. I mean, the whole back of it would start to disintegrate. So that's one of the difficulties when you have unusual things and you store them in a collection. Some things with new materials are just disintegrating. We have this fab collection of 1950s and early 60s rubber bathing suit caps. Forget about it. They have to be kept in a separate area because they're off-gassing, they're disintegrating. We're just going to have to document them and eventually probably witness destroy them because they're going, gone, and they may be damaging things around them because of the off-gassing. Donna Karan. This is, when you look like, who are important designers, what are important dresses, this is so important, it's so archetypal Donna. With the whole idea of 7 easy pieces, the black, that you can look professional, but you can also look womanly, with the gold belt buckle to add that glam accessory. This sort of, you could recognize that as a Donna Karan from a mile away. Oh, Kenzo. I'm having a senior moment. Karen Kenzo. Yes, we have a lot of wonderful Kenzos. And interestingly enough, many of them were given to us by Anna Sui, who'd been a big fan of Kenzo and had collected a lot of them. So that's always very nice when people are really interested in a designer and have a great selection of them. Similarly, a lot of our Saint Laurent Rive Gauche came from certain models and editors who had acquired personal wardrobes and then passed that on. So that kind of, we don't have much in the way of provenance for most of our objects. It's not like the Palais Galliera, where there's these illustrious, this was worn by the Empress Eugenie, this was worn by the Dauphin, this was worn by the Countess Greffeux. But we do have some things which we can track to women who are fashion professionals, and that's a really exciting thing. Calvin Klein. So the beautiful lace dress, but again, the very sort of body-conscious look. And of course, we also have things like the Calvin Klein blue jeans that were the original sort of Brooke Shields ones, things like that. French museum curators and French TV executives who've come over and filmed in our collection have been amazed when they see that in addition to high fashion, we also have things like blue jeans. And I remember the TV crews going crazy when we brought out a pair of hand-embroidered blue jeans from the 60s that the former owner's girlfriend had hand-embroidered. They said no French fashion museum would have that. But we say that's directional fashion, just as much as a couture or a designer piece, if it's something that moves fashion forward. Those hippie clothes, those were the things that inspired people like Saint Laurent. And now, my loves, my time is up. So if you want to see the rest of the alphabet, you gotta buy the book. Thank you so much. And I'm going to, I think we better move on to the next speaker so she doesn't get anxious. It's not nice when the first person hogs all the time. I'll be around and afterwards signing books after the second talk. So I'm not disappearing yet. Even if I disappear for a moment, I'll be back.